Chinua Achebe, one of Africa's greatest contemporary writers, has died. Achebe was a prominent Nigerian writer and academic, and also a vocal critic of corruption in Nigerian politics. His most famous book, Things Fall Apart, was published in 1958 and highlighted the clashes between colonialism and traditional culture in Nigeria. It sold more than 12 million copies and is often cited as the most read book in modern African literature. This was a major hit. You know, he'd been sick for a bit.
In fact, there had been rumors that he was dead already.
Yeah, there were rumors that he was dead already. He actually, I guess, died last night after a long battle with an illness. We're still not sure exactly what the illness was. He was very private about those things. But officials at Brown University sort of announced this yesterday, where he was a professor. And this is amazing. I hope people fully appreciate how important.
Well, explain for those who might not get it.
Well, I mean, a big part of Achebe's legacy was Things Fall Apart. I mean, you can think about Things Fall Apart as this major work that really puts African literature on the continent. 12 million copies sold doesn't even speak to how important it was as a site of literary criticism, as a site of conversation about colonialism. I mean, he really engaged the world to the continent of Africa, and that's something that hadn't happened before. He got people learning and reading about Africa. For a long time, people said Africa doesn't even have authors. I mean, Mortimer Adler, when he wrote the greatest books in Western civilization or in human civilization, not an African author in the bunch. So, I mean, there was this long legacy of excluding Africa from the conversation. Achebe forced the world to pay attention to Africa and to African literature.
Absolutely. I want to pull up this quote that I particularly loved. There is no moral obligation to write in a particular way, but there is a moral obligation, I think, not to ally oneself with power against the powerless. And so many of those conversations about colonialism and the fact that there were no voices telling the story of the colonized.
That's exactly right, and to tell them from a different story. I mean, the great thing about Things Fall Apart is that he talks about what this village looked like before Western colonizers come in. He talks about African culture, sustaining African culture. Now, there's an interesting tension here, because when I think of that quote, I also think about his debates with Wole Soyinka about whether or not African literature should be written in traditional African languages or whether it can be written in English. And obviously Achebe wrote in English, and there was a debate that you can't have a decolonized book or a post-colonial book if you write it in a colonial language. But to have that argument, I think that's what that quote speaks to, is that, look, it's not just about what language I write in, it's about whose story I'm telling and how I tell that story. And Achebe has always told the story of the vulnerable and the voiceless throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be interesting to see the writers that he impacts and how that voice continues, because so often in school curriculums he's placed in the Black author category, not necessarily in the international or in the immigrant category, but in that Black author category, which isn't totally appropriate, right? This is not about the Black American experience. This is about the African experience.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, also, he gets put in a box where people don't appreciate the texture and nuance of his writing. So that if we're doing a unit on, if we're talking about dislocation, if we're talking about notions of place and space, if we read The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, for example, as opposed to just Things Fall Apart, we see all these other themes and stories that the Western literary tradition hasn't even wrapped its mind around. For a long time, for example, people say, well, you know, the love story is the most enduring theme in all of Western literature. And the search for a romantic partner was never a central trope in traditional pre-colonial African literature. In other words, we look at literature through a Western lens. What Achebe forces us to do, and others, I mean, we could look at a few other people like Kwe Arma and others, is that they give us new tropes, they give us new themes, they give us new tools to understand the literature that we produce, which gives us a window into what it means to be more human.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to finish with this last quote because it makes me think of you and the work that you've done, but also how you're always on me to write a book. If you don't like someone's story, you write your own. So
that's my favorite quote of all time.